Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm here with Dr. Derek Elliott. He is a newly minted Doctor of Philosophy from Duquesne University. He specializes in philosophy of psychology as well as action theory, with a special interest in irrationality and evolutionary psychology. And today we're going to talk about his recent PhD dissertation, which is called Beyond Enlightenment, the Evolution of Agency and Modularity of the Mind in a Post-Darwinian World. So, Derek, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show. It's really a pleasure to have you on.
The pleasure is all mine, Ricardo.
Oh, okay. Okay, so let's see. Let's start with the title of your dissertation, because I guess I also decided to invite you here, first of all, due to the title, because when I first had the idea, I hadn't yet read it completely. So, but I mean, Beyond Enlightenment, the evolution of agency and modularity of the mind in a post-Darwinian world. So, it seems that what you're trying to convey with your title is that perhaps some things that we've been discovering, particularly over the last 150 years or so, through Darwinism and natural selection and things like that, is that perhaps some values and beliefs coming from the philosophers of the Enlightenment are not really that correct, let's say, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. The title actually is a play on words in a lot of ways. On the one hand, I'm talking about evolution in terms of evolutionary theory. On the other hand, too, it's sort of a call to evolve our own thinking about these topics, and particularly the topic of the title had thrown some people off when they thought about post-Darwinian. They were thinking more along the lines of some sort of a postmodern idea about things. But for me, it's really about, this is the world now, the intellectual world that we've inherited after Darwin, right? And so it doesn't mean anything more than that. This is the world after Darwin. He's completely changed the way that we look at things. He's given us a different conceptual toolkit with which we can analyze phenomena around us. And it's time that we start taking advantage of that.
Right. Okay, so I've already talked on the show with people like Michael Ruse and other people like that, and I've already went through some of the values of the Enlightenment, and even some that come from before the Enlightenment that Darwinism really questioned. Darwinism when applied to philosophy, of course. But what would you say are some of the main values or beliefs of the Enlightenment that you really question in your thesis?
Yeah, so it's kind of difficult to narrow down precisely what enlightenment is. It's a debate amongst scholars that even when I was doing my research, there was no clear consensus. Do we consider it a historical era? If so, when does that historical period begin? Is it a set of ideas? Did those ideas themselves have a lifespan of their own? Are they still alive and well? By every indication, it seems like these ideas are still rampant. It's a hot topic right now. As we know, Steven Pinker published a very successful book entitled Enlightenment Now. And it's sort of this romanticization of the Enlightenment, that we adhere to Enlightenment values, that we continue in the spirit of the Enlightenment. So if we're going to look at enlightenment that way, we have to start asking, well, what is the Enlightenment? Now, for me, every story needs a villain, and the Enlightenment in many ways is my villain. And I try to zero in on what I call the Enlightenment attitude. Like every good story, the villain often thinks that they're working for noble purposes, right? So I'm not somebody that, I don't dislike the Enlightenment. I don't regret that it happened. I admire it immensely. I love the thought that came out of it. I think that it was one of the brightest spots in at least the Western intellectual tradition since ancient Greece. But we've sort of held on to some of these ideas that are no longer tenable. Now, in particular, what the Enlightenment attitude, the values that the Enlightenment attitude holds that I've identified through the work of people like Michael Gillespie, even Steven Pinker is pretty open about this, is the idea of the freedom of the individual, the goodness of science, the goodness of social progress, but above all, the value of reason. And it seems as though what the Enlightenment really espouses is this idea of human nature that that stresses that we are somehow essentially rational creatures. And this is an idea that, you know, when you look around at the way in which we behave and how we interact with one another, you look at, for example, the war on terror, you look at things like mass shootings, you sit there and you start asking yourself these questions like, how is this stuff happening? How is this stuff happening? How is this stuff happening? And we don't really have a good response. And we just sit there and we contend, oh, people are rational creatures. People are rational creatures. You know, if we just have a strong enough argument, everybody's just going to concede to that argument. They'll change their minds. The problem isn't that we're irrational in some capacity. It's that, you know, we just haven't been exposed to a good argument yet. This just seems absurd to me, right? And we need to start questioning once more what reason is. And I don't think that the paradox, the irony, if you will, in this is that many of the Enlightenment thinkers, at least Kant, for example, would say, yeah, absolutely. We need to start criticizing reason, figuring out what is its limits, how does it work? And we're in a better position today to do that than we've ever been with the advances that we have in neuroscience, comparative psychology, evolutionary psychology, social psychology, ethology, even to some degree anthropology. And, you know, so my project then is to try to put all of this into view, if you will, to say, all right, this is where we are. This is the view of reason we've held up to this point. And this view of reason, it's time for us to move beyond this view of reason.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's very interesting that you refer to reason, and perhaps there are also other cognitive features of the human mind that the Enlightenment figures refer to, and perhaps they think about them and talk about them in ways that convey the message that perhaps things like reason work in ways that are perhaps idealized by them. And I mean, perhaps that's one of the big issues that you point to in your thesis, in your work. And I mean, we could perhaps talk about others, and we're going to talk about them here today, certainly, but perhaps would you say that that's perhaps the main issue here? It's not that you're questioning or someone is questioning the existence or not of reason, but perhaps it, as an evolved feature of our minds, it works differently than the way the philosophers of the Enlightenment and perhaps scientists as well put it for a long time now, right?
Yeah, so my relationship with reason is complicated. On the one hand, you know, it seems so obvious that we have this capacity to reason, right? But on the other hand, there might be more to this than we've thought. We may be taking this for granted. So, you know, with vision, for example, it was long sort of held that however the world is the way that we perceive it. But we know this to be wrong now, and we know in terms of the neuroscience that we've got neurons that code for vertical lines, horizontal lines, diagonal lines, neurons that code for motion in a horizontal direction and a vertical direction that try to detect spatial differences. And all of these things together in aggregate eventually work their way up to the prefrontal cortex and furnish for us this visual experience. And we also know through physics that the world is nothing like the way that we experience it. To that end, I can't help but wonder if the thing that we've been calling reason all along and supposing to be a unified faculty or ability or capacity, if you will, is not itself its own kind of aggregate. And when you look at the literature in comparative psychology, for example, you do find instances all over the place where, animals are able to do one thing, but they're not able to do another. So, for example, Nathan Emery and Christopher Bird popularized what's become known as the Aesop's fable paradigm. Now, in Aesop's fable of the pitcher and the crow, it was this story about how this crow was thirsty and it came upon a pitcher and there was a little bit of water in it. But the problem was the neck of the pitcher was too narrow and too deep for the crow to get the water. So what did the crow do? Well, Aesop relays to us that, clever as it was, it found some pebbles, displaced the volume of water in the pitcher, and was able to drink. Now, for the longest time, we took this to be a moral, right? That if you just keep it something long enough, you'll succeed. But Bird and Emery, they decided to see whether or not there's any kind of truth to this experiment. So they took a set of rooks, which are, corvids, birds like crows, and they wanted to see whether or not they could solve the Aesop's fable paradigm, is what they called it. And they set up an experiment just like the way that Aesop relayed to us in his story. And what he found was that these birds were capable of problem solving, right? They had a novel situation introduced to them, and they were able to take objects and figure out that if you place these objects into these cylinders, you could displace the water and get the access to treat. Now, this experiment has been replicated with young children. It's been replicated with Caledonian crows, but unfortunately for scrub jays, they're not able to figure out how to solve the Aesop's fable paradigm. So naturally, our tendency here at this point is to think, well, maybe scrub jays are not as intelligent as crows and rooks, the corvids. And that's a tempting position to take because we have a tendency to organize things into hierarchies. Human beings are at the top of the hierarchy, right? But scrub jays do something really fascinating, right? So it was Nikki Clayton, another researcher, who discovered that what scrub jays can do is they are aware of the presence of other scrub jays and they can plan for future events. So when they're given food, for example, they'll eat what they need to now. And if they're worried that they're not going to have food later, they'll then hide or cache that food for a later date and time, especially if they know they're going to be in that area. Now, another interesting twist on this is that if there's another scrub jay present and it notices its rival, right? Then it will wait for its rival to leave, return to the place where it cached that food, and hide it in a new place. That's pretty intelligent. That's pretty remarkable, actually, especially when you consider that, as far as we've been able to tell at this point, monkeys don't do this. So it seems to me that there are a number of what you might call quasi-rational or rational-like capacities that are operating in all of these different creatures, including humans. And I think that in our case, what we might be calling reason could be just a number of these capacities operating in concert through the medium of language. And it has the illusion that it's a unified capacity when it might not be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, at a certain point earlier in the conversation, you referred also to freedom, and I guess you also alluded to free will as another belief, let's say, of the Enlightenment, because it's really important, or it was really important for people in the Enlightenment to think that people were really had the freedom to behave as they willed, let's say. I mean, I guess that we can tackle this issue from several different points, and perhaps the first one would be that, I mean, most of what goes around in our minds operates at a subconscious level, and we don't really have access to it, and even what motivates us and what causes our behavior. I mean, we're pretty bad at identifying those sorts of things, correct?
Oh, absolutely. And this is something that I think the ingredients for this idea has been there for a long time, but it's only recently started increasingly picking up within intellectual circles. I found all the way back to, I think it was 1932, with an experiment by Norman Maier, who was a Gestalt psychologist. And what he decided to do was set up a rope in the middle of a room, and there was another rope at the far edge of the room. And the goal was to try to see if people can figure out how to tie these ropes together. And what he found was that people would spend time in this room, and they're sitting there problem solving, and they just there's one solution that he had in mind, the difficult solution, if you will, that he wanted people to find, and he would leave them to their devices until they figured out how to do this. Interestingly enough, when enough time would pass, he would have the experimenter walk into the room, brush by the central rope, and it would set it into a swinging motion. And all of a sudden, one of the the name's slipping my mind. Participants, right? All of a sudden, one of the participants would say, "Hey, look, we can set this rope into a pendulum-like fashion and attach it to the other rope." When queried after the experiment was over, a number of the participants actually said that the idea just came to them, right? And there was a relationship between the time the experimenter would brush the central rope and the time that the participants solved the problem. The participants themselves were not aware of. They claimed that the idea came to them on their own. Some of them would even say that they didn't even reason the idea. They just visualized the idea, right? They thought about monkeys swinging on trees, and they're like, "Oh, look, I can solve a problem this way." But others, they thought, "Oh, of course I thought of this." Now, the interesting thing, of course, is that when an experimenter didn't brush past the rope, some participants didn't solve the experiment at all, and others, if they solved it, it was usually very quickly. But it was only after the experimenter brushed past the rope did many solve it within 60 seconds. Now, when you have something as statistically significant as that, it's clear that that played a role in figuring out how to solve that problem, and yet so many of the participants were unaware of it. That was 1932, right? Fast forward about 40-ish years, and you get Richard Nesbitt, right? And he has his set of stockings that he presents to a number of individuals, and he says, "Hey, by the way, which of these is your favorite?" Right? People sit there and they pick up each nylon, they're looking at it, and they're like, "I think I like this one the most." You ask why, they sit there and they give a number of reasons, but unbeknownst to these participants, right, the nylons are identical to one another. And there was a tendency to select the farmost right nylon. So again, there's almost like this right side bias that these participants have that they're unaware of. Even more recently, and perhaps more significantly, has been the work by Peter Johansson and Lars Hall on choice blindness, right? So in this case, and this is far more clever than anything that's been done, they present participants with, say, photos of people that they might find attractive, and they're like, here's a couple of photos, select the one that you like the most, right? People make their selection, and then when they're not looking, he swaps out the one that they liked with one that they did not like. And he said, "Why did you choose this photo?" They're looking at it, and they're like, "Well, obviously," and they start enumerating the number of reasons why they chose the photo, but it's not even the photo that they selected. Right? So it's fascinating to see these experiments, and you have to just admire psychologists for the cleverness that they have in designing these things. But we learn rather quickly that we are out of touch with our decision-making processes. We're out of touch with our motivations. We make selections, and then we try to construct justifications for those selections after the fact. And that seems to be how the decision-making process works by and large.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's very, very important for this discussion, all of what you just said, because I think that I've squeezed in the topic of free will and freedom here when we were talking still about reason, because I think it's very difficult to talk about these topics separately, because I've been having a lot of discussions with mainly evolutionary psychologists, but particularly after the ones I had with people like Hugo Mercier and Nick Cheder and Alexander Rosenberg. I mean, it's very difficult to look at what goes around in our minds, and particularly how reason or rationality works after that, because it seems that people from the Enlightenment and people that still promote the values of the Enlightenment, and as we've already said here, that's not really the problem. It's just the way people deal with their beliefs about how the human mind works, let's say. Because, it is one thing to say that, as you just said, through the experiments coming from social psychology and other disciplines like that, that we're not really aware of most of the things, of the processes that go around in our minds most of the time. And when we're asked to explain why we performed a certain behavior or why we did such or such thing, we're really bad at identifying the causes behind it. So, when people believe that we have a certain particular feature of our minds called reason that we use, that evolved to motivate us to seek the truth. So that's already a very problematic point to make. But if they go further and say that whatever we gain as knowledge through that cognitive process also trumps what happens subconsciously, even in terms of our decision-making process. Let's put it that way. So, what I'm saying here, does it make sense or not?
Yeah, absolutely. And, so just to circle back around to the question of free will, right? I don't know right now how I feel about free will. All right. I have ideas and I'm leaning towards a kind of emergentism. But what I do know about free will is that I don't think it has anything to do with conscious thought or reasoning, right? If there is free will, then it's more intuitive, more spontaneous. It takes us in many ways back to the ancient conception of free will that you find in somebody like Aristotle, who tells us that it's a matter of motion coming from within, right? Rather than external, rather than having the motion caused from external forces. And when he says this, he means obviously that if someone were to barge into your room, pick up your arms and start moving your arms around and forcing you to move your mouth, you're not doing that, right? But as it stands, you're sitting there, you're talking to me, you're moving your hands. All of that activity seems to proceed from you as an organism, how you're structured, your neural system, your muscular system, all of these things play together to produce these things. It's not clear that they're caused by any sort of outside agents that are, that are coercing you in many ways. So it's a mitigated view of freedom, and some people may not say that it's freedom at all, because they might argue that, when you analyze it down to the atomic level and you figure out how all of these things interact with one another, you're not really doing anything. Maybe, I don't know. But, for now, I think that this is the best view of freedom that we have, and that if you like free will, that's the only thing left, right? Now, when it comes to the topic of reason and, how we're supposed to be thinking about this, it seems that the Enlightenment attitude, what I call the Enlightenment attitude, was influenced significantly by Descartes. And what Descartes, bequeathed to us is three assumptions about the way the mind works that we've had a really difficult time forfeiting. One, he tells us that the mind is fundamentally rational. Well, we know that that's obviously not the case. I mean, if you just even spend a little bit of time in comparative psychology or ethology, you have no explanation for how animals are able to do the things that they do unless you want to say that animals are rational. But then you're going to start running into difficult questions like, well, what's the relationship between reason and language? How can we assess whether or not animals are rational? And then when we look at something like the Aesop's fable paradigm, we have to have a good explanation. Well, why is the scrub jay failing at Aesop's fable paradigm, but then is clever enough to hide food from its peers? So it just raises more questions to attribute rationality to animals in the way that we think of it in the Cartesian sense, right? That's not to say that we can't think of animals as behaving rationally in other senses. The second thing he tries to tell us is that the mind is a unity, right? That somehow the mind is not only rational, but it's unified. It's non-composite. It's nothing like the body, right? That you can't divide the mind into parts, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And both of these assumptions together deliver to us a third assumption, which is that the mind is transparent, right? You can access all the parts of your mind. And clearly, this is not the case, right? We have to let go of these ideas if we're going to make any progress and make sense of these things. Now, to Descartes' credit, and this is something that I find kind of, in some ways humorous, is that when Descartes began his inquiry, he entertained broadly three possibilities, right? That the mind is the way it is as a result of there being some kind of omnipotent, benevolent God, chance, right, or nature, which he, made synonymous with chance, or a malevolent, evil, all-powerful demon, right? And he concluded that if the mind is the way that it seems to be from his perspective, it must be the case that there's this benevolent God that gave us this kind of mind. So now we can track truth. We can figure out all the mysteries of the universe. We can solve all problems. We can master nature. We can have all sorts of material prosperity, live forever, and never get into war again. Obviously, much of that is problematic and false. But when you take God out of the so Descartes, I admire his consistency. You adopt that position about the mind. You can explain it with an assumption about a benevolent creator. Now, if you secularize that and you try to drop the benevolent creator out of the picture, it becomes really difficult defending a Cartesian theory of mind. Like, you're telling me that it's just a totally random chance accident. The human beings are the only creatures in all of the universe that somehow ended up with a mind such as the way that Descartes imagines it. It's rational, it's unified, and it's oriented towards the truth. This just seems so far-fetched that it amazes me that anybody could at once adhere to something like evolutionary theory and these Cartesian ideas about the mind. Something has to give. And of the two, I think it's clear that the Cartesian theory of the mind is now outdated and should be on its way out.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and you just brought Descartes to the table, and I think it's very interesting because looking back at his work, at a certain point he says that he decided, even though that's very doubtful, he decided to suspend all of his beliefs and try to work from there. And I mean, at a certain point, he simply decided that there had to be some sort of God, and because he had this idea of a God, of a perfect being in his head, right? And so he couldn't have this idea if it wasn't true that a God existed. And then if a God existed, what he saw in the world had to be right, otherwise it wouldn't be a God, it would be a demon or something like that, tricking him. But it's very interesting because he really believed that through some sort of a conscious process and through reason, he could have complete control over what happened or what went around in his mind, but he really didn't, because we even know nowadays, particularly through disciplines like the cognitive science of religion and things like that, that even the idea of a metaphysical being or something like that is something that arises from underlying evolved cognitive features of our mind as well, and even perhaps other things that also he considered when going along with that thought, right?
Yeah, I'm not. So when it comes to Descartes, the thing that has always fascinated me is the juncture that he presents to himself. He wants to know, how is it that what he thinks is true can actually be true? And he supposes that that's the case, right? That when you know something like 2 + 2 = 4, right? How is it that you know that idea of yours happens to match the way that reality is? And so the juncture that he presents to himself is that, well, you know, it seems as though we can make that we can trust inferences, logical inferences, if we've been designed in the right way, right? And so ultimately, in some ways, he's kind of like a progenitor to intelligent design theory. So, you know, his solution is that if the mind were the product of chance, our inferences could not possibly be reliable. They would have to be subject to the same kind of chance that, you know, we find in nature. That, you know, maybe sometimes these inferences are good, sometimes they're bad. How can we trust our inferences? And that was kind of a crisis for him. He was very uncomfortable with that possibility. And, you know, as it stands, it looks like maybe that path is the path that he should have explored a little more thoroughly, because things seem to be more like that than this idea that, you know, a good inference is reliably good at all times. That as long as you start out with the right propositions and you make the right inference, you'll have the right conclusion. But, you know, people that adopt that position, you know, they don't ask, well, where do those propositions come from? Why are we using this inference as opposed to that inference? You know, and how do we know that these inferences are even, or how do we know that these propositions are even sound in the first place, right? So, you know, these are questions that are now beginning to be explored. The literature on cognitive biases is revealing quite a bit to us when it comes to these types of things. For example, it was Daniel Kahneman that identified the substitution heuristic, where when we're presented with a difficult question, what is it we like to do? Well, we like to, you know, sort of envision a simpler question and then try to answer that one in its place. And again, you know, it's easy to think, well, people are somehow doing this on purpose, that they're devious, that they're deceptive, that they're insecure and they don't know the answer to that question. But, you know, really a lot of these processes are just automatic, right? You are posed the difficult question. You don't identify it necessarily as a difficult question. But were we to measure things like pupillary dilation, heart rate, cortisol levels, you might see a little bump in stress. And in response to that, let's just shift the question altogether and make it something that we can work with. So, you know, these are fascinating times, and you know, it's kind of interesting to see how some of these things were anticipated, but they just weren't explored.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. So I would like to ask you what is your opinion about Mercier's and Sperber's enigma of reason and the argumentative theory of reason. But just before we get specifically into that, I guess that another perspective that we can have about reason and rationality has to do with the way we think about it, and perhaps what we classify as rational behavior. Because I mean, perhaps since we're talking in Darwinian terms here, perhaps it would make much more sense to classify as rational behavior perhaps the sorts of behavior that we would adopt and that would increase our fitness, both personal and inclusive. That is behavior that would be adaptive to us, and not really something that, if we were to pursue intellectually or mentally, would lead us to the truth or to just think in strictly logical terms or something like that.
Yeah, so this is an interesting topic because I think a lot of people, when they think about evolutionary theory, they tend to think of survival of the fittest, right? They water it down to something along those lines. And it's the same kind of problem that has been posed to me by people familiar with my work. They're like, well, if you're defending, if you're trying to analyze these things in terms of evolutionary theory, what's the ultimate good for man, right? Is it just to reproduce and have babies and dominate your peers and your competitors? Well, no, that's not the types of creatures that we are. What I think makes us fascinating is that there's three, if you might call them, evolutionary domains in which we live and breathe, right? There's the natural domain, in which we're primarily concerned about survival, right? So you go on a hike through the woods, all of a sudden your bottom-up attention is directed towards what seems to be a tessellated pattern on the ground. All of a sudden your muscles tense, your neck turns, your eyes look, and it's a snake, right? This is a good thing, right? It keeps you alive, it keeps you healthy, it keeps you, it helps you continue to live and breathe. The second domain would be what we might call the sexual domain, right? So we're motivated by sexual preferences, we're sexual creatures. It should no longer be taboo to pronounce these things, right? This is a very important part of what it means to be a human being. We find things attractive, we find people attractive, that motivates our behavior, that helps determine how we interact with other people, so on and so forth. The third part of this that often gets left out of the equation is that we're also social creatures. And to be a social creature is to be concerned with how others take you to be. When you consider our roots in foraging groups that were highly egalitarian, we seem to have evolved this very strong sense of who we are relative to how the group perceives us. And we take this to be something very important. Now, this is something that would have made sense 50,000 years ago, where you're in a small group of 20 to 50 to 75 people, in which you're expected to contribute to that group, and there's some kind of a misunderstanding, right? A competitor accuses you of cheating, you took more food than was necessary, or you didn't pull your weight when you were out hunting some megafauna. And without language, there's not a whole lot of options here, right? If somehow they're able to, persuade the group of their sentiments, you're going to be kicked out of the group, if not killed, right? And the problem there, if you're kicked out of the group, and we know this from studies of primitive societies today, is that it's as good as death, right? The world, the environment is a hostile place. As much as we fantasize about the frontiersman living out in the woods, cutting down trees and sustaining himself, that's just not realistic in a world without technology. You have no idea if a storm's coming. You have no idea if there are predators lurking around the corner. You have to constantly prepare your weapons. If you twist your ankle, it's already going to be difficult to continue navigating through the forest, especially if you're a couple miles away from home. So we rely heavily on group membership and leaning on other people and caring for other people. And with the advent of language, all of a sudden, you're able to negotiate with your accusers, with the rest of the group. Sure, they might think that I took stuff, but clearly I didn't, and here are the reasons why. I should be a part of it. I should continue part of this. In fact, that person's lying, and we should kick them out of the community, ostracize them, right? So this social dimension, in which we have a vested interest in our reputation, is another part of that evolutionary question of trying to maximize our fitness. It's our survival, our sexual fitness, and our social fitness. We want to get along with others. We want others to like us. We want to feel like we're a part of something. We want to feel like we're making contributions. We want to feel like we're admired. And again, like any kind of evolutionary explanation, these are the ultimate explanations, not the proximal ones. The proximal ones are the ones that, are the ones that are crossing our mind. We convince ourselves, I don't care what anybody else thinks, but our behavior betrays us. It tells us otherwise, that we do care. And we do try to rally people to our side of things. When it comes to Mercy and Sperber's interactionist theory of reason, I think it very eloquently ties a lot of these things together. And I think that it's a view of reason worth considering as a replacement to the Cartesian view of reasoning. And, it sort of shakes us out of this disillusionment of solitary reasoning where we can arrive at the truth by locking ourselves in our room and starting with assumptions and critiquing those assumptions and seeing what follows from those assumptions. All of that's absurd, right? This is, in some ways, a return to a Platonic Socratic conception of reasoning, where if we want to arrive at something worthwhile, I'm reluctant to call it truth because I don't want it to be, I don't want to misunderstand this as we have final answers to things through interacting with one another, but a truth for the community, or a truth that we can put into practice. I'm a bit of a pragmatist when it comes to truth. Then we have to subject our ideas to the scrutiny of others, interact with them, exchange them, and see what emerges from that interaction.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about questions relating to agency and things like that. So, I mean, it's pretty obvious, particularly from studies done in biology and psychology as well, perhaps more particularly in comparative psychology, that, humans and also other animals, they don't really need to be conscious of the reasons that motivate them, or whatever happens in their minds that motivate them to seek this or that, or to perform this or that kind of behavior. They don't even need to be conscious at all to behave. If necessary, we could even go back to plants, and they have certain kinds of behavior, and they don't seem to be conscious at all, and they don't seem to need consciousness at all to have those sorts of behaviors. And even some lower animals, we also question if they really have some sort of consciousness or not. So, with that on the table, what place does it leave for consciousness from an evolutionary perspective? I don't know if you want to specifically talk about consciousness here or not, but I've already had a couple of conversations with people like Colin McGinn and Michael Graziano, and I will also have Keith Frankish on the show to talk a little bit more about illusionism. It's with this on the table, it's a bit difficult to understand why really did consciousness had to evolve, and particularly to the level where we have it in humans.
Yeah, I don't know how I feel about consciousness at this stage. I, for a long time, wanted to think that consciousness was something special, not even something special to human beings, something special in general. I wanted to think that, it's obvious that we're conscious, but the more that I think about consciousness, we sort of think of it as it's almost like an introspective capacity to look at the inner contents of our minds, to perceive the inner contents of our minds as we perceive the outer world. But for me, I'm trying to take a step back and I guess work up to an idea of consciousness. And I don't want to just presume right out of the gate that consciousness is the way that we've assumed it to be here up to this point. So I have to ask myself, well, what is consciousness, right? Is it simply awareness of one's surroundings, or is it some higher kind of awareness where it's awareness of inner contents as well? Is it, having a sense of self, or having a sense of self relative to things in the environment? These are questions that I think we need to parse out before we endeavor upon answering this question. So as of now, the view that I adopt is a little more moderate, and I am very attracted to Crick and Coach's view of consciousness as almost a dashboard, right? Where some of the most important stuff relative to our situation here and now is brought to our attention as an organism. Now, some of that stuff is ideas that cross the mind that might be important. Some of that stuff is stuff that's happening out in the environment. I don't know that that's unique to human beings, and I have to wonder whether or not there's a sense of consciousness of the external environment alone, right? So what I find intriguing, one of my hobbies is macro photography. And in particular, I really, really, really love photographing insects. And I'm fascinated by their behavior and all of the details that you see when you look at them under magnified resolution. To do this well, I have to buy a macro lens, attach it to a camera, and then go out into the field and observe and watch and wait, try to get the perfect shot. And this requires a lot of patience. And you see a side of the world that you don't normally see. You see these insects engage in what looks to be complex behavior for what they are. It's clear that they're not simply little machines, that they don't have the same reaction to all things. It's not as simple as a one-to-one reaction. Now, this might be anecdotal, and so you question the reliability of it, but when you look at, there have been studies, for example, on bumblebees, where they seem to engage in learning behavior. They learn where the predator, like on what color flowers predators are to be most likely found, and they adjust their behavior accordingly. They adjust their flight patterns. They take a longer time at these flowers where they found predators to inspect them before landing to collect pollen. And sometimes they even get it wrong. Sometimes they seem to make the judgment that there's a predator, and they'll fly away from the flower when in fact there's no predator at all. So when you see this capacity for misrepresentation, when you see this capacity for error, and when you see this capacity for learning, I have to think that there's more going on than we've tended to think. So that's just at the small scale, right? You're talking about a bumblebee with a meager 100,000 neurons. So this is so what this sort of inclined me to start thinking about is, if these are not simply machines, then what does that say about us? What can we learn about ourselves? And where do we stand in relation to these things? Unfortunately, evolutionary theory sort of neatly ties all of this together. One of the articles that I had read a while ago that I had increasingly become fond of was an article by John Searle called Animal Minds. And in that, he pitches what we might call a thesis of biological continuity. So what he wanted to know in that article was, do do animals have thought processes, intentionality, and consciousness? And, you know, he talks about his relationship with his dog and how he can make these different inferences. He critiques Cartesian theory and arrives at the idea that he proposes the idea that if behavior is sufficiently similar to what an intelligent creature would do in that situation, and if it's biologically similar to an intelligent creature, then perhaps similar things are taking place in that creature's mental life as it is in the intelligent creature's mental life, our own mental life, right? And I think this is a wonderful idea, and I think it's a great place to start when we're studying these things. And we want to be careful too, because some of these creatures might have different thought processes, radically different thought processes, and deal with problems in a radically different way than our own. And so we don't want to prematurely dismiss them if they handle things differently. So for example, going back to the Aesop's fable paradigm, the rooks and the Caledonian crows very predictably are able to learn how to displace water by dropping heavy objects into the cylinder and getting their treat. Raccoons do this some of the time, but they also seem to be much more playful and mischievous. And in fact, some of them sort of rejected the experiment altogether, knocked over the cylinder and got their treat that way, right? And they seem to do it as if they understood, like, why am I playing around with these heavy objects? I'm just going to, you know, get my treat directly, right? So you might say that they have a different problem-solving ability from Caledonian crows and young children, and you know, perhaps even scrub jays have a different. You know, maybe it's not that scrub jays lack the problem-solving capacity as corvids, but maybe they just have a different way of solving problems. So it's a great place to start, this idea of biological or evolutionary continuity. We also want to be careful that we don't suppose that there's a similarity of degree such that, you know, get into that hierarchical mode of thinking again. Humans are at the top, and yes, these things have agency, and these things have mental life, and these things have experience, but it's in just a diminished sense from what we human beings have. It might just be something different altogether. You know, I think it was the species of shrimp that I can't remember exactly which kind. I want to say mantis shrimp, but I could be mistaken. That sees many, many more colors than we do because it has more rods and cones. Obviously, its visual experience is going to be very different from our own. And when it comes to insects who have compound eyes, the way that compound eyes resolve vision is very different from the way that our own eyes resolve vision. And so their visual experience, if and we're assuming that they have visual experience, is going to be very different from our own.
Mm-hmm. Okay, but again, regarding issues related to agency and agents and things like that, what should we call an agent? Because I think that when people talk about something or someone being an agent, most of the time at least they're thinking about a being at least that is able to control its actions at least to a certain degree and perhaps create some modifications in the world around it, because I mean even we have these cognitive tool that we've evolved that is called the hyperactive agency detection device, and when we see something happen in the world, we immediately tend to think that something or someone caused it. We attribute agency to causation, let's say. So, I mean, if we really arrive to a point where we know that what happens, even in us as humans consciously, is not really that important in terms of regulating behavior and controlling it and things like that, and doesn't have an important causal relationship with behavior. I mean, what should we call an agent then?
Yeah, so I like to think, I try to think of, you know, what we might call the minimal requirements for agency. right? So the first minimal requirement for agency would be something like causal responsibility. It's not the same as moral responsibility. It's not the same as legal responsibility. It's not the same as social responsibility, etc. Right? These are all various degrees of responsibility that are in some ways parasitic on causal responsibility. Causal responsibility, to put it simply, is the idea that, you know, the thing itself is the cause of what happened, right? So, for example, if you decide to leave the tavern on your own volition, right, your own 2 feet, you're the cause of your leaving of the tavern, right? But if you happen to get a little raucous in the tavern and the bouncer picks you up and tosses you through the tavern doors, yeah, it's true that there was a leaving of the tavern by you, right? But you did not cause that to happen, right? It was not something that proceeded from your internal states. Now, obviously, we need some additional qualifications here. So in order to separate this out from mechanical causation, right? So, for example, a tree, you might say, rots on its own. It's causally responsible for its rotting, in a sense, maybe. But would we call that an agent? Well, obviously not. To have a better example, right? You've got door openers that are automatic, that use infrared and lasers to determine whether or not an object is moving, whether it's of a sufficient size to trigger the opening of the door. Are these automatic door openers agents? Using a system that simple. When an alarm triggers because there is an intruder, is the alarm an agent because it's causally responsible for the signaling that there's an intruder? No, there has to be some additional qualifications. So another qualification that I like to attach to this is that the behavior has to be flexible, adaptively flexible. Right. So in order to eliminate these mechanical behaviors, what we want to see in a creature is that when it runs up against a problem, it's able to try to solve and figure out a way around that problem to achieve the goal that it seems to have, that its behavior indicates it has. So, if there's a, if you were to present a piece of food to something, and it seems to come after the food. It wants the food. The animal wants the food, and then you put a bowl over the food. Well, what's it going to do? Is it going to forget that the food's there altogether, or is it going to draw upon its resources? Perhaps memory, its motor resources, motor activity, things like that, and try to figure out, I know there's food here a second ago, so, what's going on, right? An automatic door opener is not going to run through this same series to figure out, like, well, I thought there was a person here a second ago, so, should I open the door? Should I not open the door? It's what we might call a fixed response to an environmental stimulus, right? Whereas in the case of an agent, what we're going to find are malleable responses to environmental stimuli. And I think that the quality of the behavior, the complexity of the behavior, scales up with the complexity of the organism, all right? So I couldn't tell you exactly where agency begins. I don't want to say that, the cutoff is the bumblebee, but we leave the mosquito behind. I don't want to say that the cutoff is as high up the chain as that of a canine, and we leave everything else behind. It's something that I think we need to explore through comparative studies, through ethological studies, just to see exactly how complex is the behavior that these different creatures exhibit. And it's kind of refreshing to see research finally going into insect behavior, because I think we're starting to learn that even their behavior is more complex than we've imagined up to this point.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so now let's talk about self-deception, because I mean, this nowadays is a very complicated topic, because I think that from a biological slash psychological perspective, the first big name, the first person that really tackled this issue from an evolutionary perspective was perhaps Robert Rivers, and he said basically that it would make sense from an evolutionary perspective for us to have evolved self-deception as an adaptation of the mind, because it would make it much more easy for us to deceive other people as well, if we beforehand deceive ourselves, because if we know that we are telling a lie, perhaps something in our behavior would give the other person certain signs or cues, and she would be able to read through our lies, and so it would really mess our strategy, let's say our social strategy there. But
Sure.
recently I've talked with Robert Kurzban, and I bring this to the table because your dissertation is based on the modularist approach to the human mind, coming from an evolutionary psychology, and he really recently questioned the approach made by Robert Rivers, in the sense that he says that perhaps it is not really that we hold two beliefs at the same time, and perhaps one of them is not available to us consciously, but it's just that in different situations, different modules that lead to different beliefs are more or less active, and perhaps that also happens in different social situations and with different people, and so on and so forth. So what would you have to say about that?
Yeah, so I admire Robert Trivers and William von Hippel's theory. I think it was a great step forward, applying evolutionary theory to classical philosophical psychological problems. It raises a number of issues, though, right? And one of the issues is that, well, if you are deceiving yourself in such a way that you're no longer aware of the deception, to what degree is it even worth calling it deception, right? You sincerely believe that X or Y is true, so how can it be classified as self-deception? Why isn't it just you're mistaken, or you're wrong, or anything else? I mean, it's not clear when we go headway into that we can any longer distinguish the difference between a mistaken belief and a belief that you've somehow adopted as your own to deceive yourself. The other question, of course, this raises is, what is it that you're deceiving, right? If you are adopting a belief strategically as your own in an effort to deceive yourself, well, what is what is it that you're trying to deceive in the first place? It's almost as if there's a covert Cartesian assumption of the self being packaged into the theory. Now, I like the idea. I'm very, very fond of modularity theory, and I think it's extremely helpful in a number of ways. But when it comes down to it, I still want to understand the phenomenon of self-deception as something that's irrational, as something that is maladaptive. And so I have to ask myself, well, how can we do this? How can we do this in an evolutionary framework? And I think that when it comes down to it, self-deception has nothing to do with deception. And I think that's kind of been the problem for a long time, because as soon as we invoke, it's almost as if we've used a very poor word to describe the phenomenon, because we think of self-deception as involving this intent to deceive, and that only introduces a paradox, namely, what's being deceived, what's doing the deceiving, right? How is it possible that you can at once know something is true and yet deny that it's true at the same time? This seems like a contradiction. And the modularity approach has a very elegant solution to that, which is just that modules are they are encapsulated, insulated from one another. And so what one module acknowledges, another module doesn't have to acknowledge, right? And that's a solution that works. It's not too dissimilar from the solution that Davidson adopts. He also compartmentalizes the mind and says that we can explain self-deception by thinking of the mind in terms of parts, that, you know, one part acknowledges this, the other part denies it. So now you've got your self-deception. But again, I think all of this goes too far and it gets unnecessarily complicated. I see self-deception as almost an evolved response that at times can be adaptive and at times can be maladaptive. And what is that evolved response? It's a firing of a fight or flight response in response to mental contents, if you will. So you imagine that things can be thus and so. But rather than confirm or disconfirm that things are thus and so, the possibility that it's thus and so is so frightening, so terrifying that you turn away from it altogether. So you're sleeping in your room at night. There's a flash of lightning. The room illuminates briefly, and you see this figure in the corner of your room, right? Overcome with terror. You're like, oh my gosh, maybe somebody's in the room. I feel like I just saw somebody in the room. Well, what do you do? Well, the rational thing to do would be to turn on the lights, look to see if anybody's there, or, if you're really aggressive, just go straight towards the thing and try to tackle it, right? But so many of us, instead, we take the cover, pull it up over our heads, and we're just like, let's hope for the best, right? So we avoid the truth, namely of whether or not there's actually something there or not there, hoping that things will work out anyway. And to me, I think that really strikes at the heart of self-deception. It's an avoidance strategy that we use as a kind of flight response from things that we think are probable or to some degree, right? It doesn't have to be almost a near certainty. And in fact, there's a lot of research that shows that the more likely something is, the more likely we are to finally concede and say, yeah, I guess I need to do something about this. We do this with our health all the time, right? We see some minor symptoms suggesting that there could be a problem. And we're like, oh, nothing's wrong. I'm fine. I'm not going to go to the doctor. I'm just going to wait it out. Everything's going to go back to normal. But eventually, if there is an actual problem, you sort of reach this critical mass where it's unavoidable at that point. You're like, I really need to see a doctor. This is not going away. My quality of life is impacted. Everybody around me sees that there's an issue, so I need to go and get this figured out, checked out, etc. And I find self-deception works a lot in this way, and that in itself is a form of self-deception. That when there's a possibility for something to be either true or false, and it's something that frightens us, rather than try to confirm or disconfirm it, we avoid it and hope that it works out.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so would another good example of self-deception that is maladaptive, would it be perhaps overconfidence? That is when people are so full of themselves that they might put themselves through certain risks that at the extreme might even kill them.
So it kind of depends on the cause of the overconfidence. I think that's where we can really start figuring out whether or not that counts as a form of self-deception. Is the overconfidence a response to a fear that, maybe you're not what you think you are? Or is it just another symptom of what we call the superiority bias, where you think that you're much better than everybody else around you? In the latter case, I'm more inclined to classify that as a form of wishful thinking rather than a form of self-deception. And I do think that the two phenomena are distinct from one another. So how does wishful thinking work as opposed to self-deception? Wishful thinking seems to involve, this a belief that you want to be true so badly, you take it to be true, right? But now the question is, well, what kind of belief is it? Why would you do this, etc.? And I think the answer to that is that many of the beliefs that are caused by our wishes that we want to be true involve ourselves, right? We wish so badly that we're very good at basketball, for example, or we wish so badly that we're an intellectual, or we wish so badly that we're attractive. So there's an element to these fantasies that is self-enhancing. And the only reason this makes any sense whatsoever is when you consider the fact that we are social creatures, that we're self-enhancing because we're hoping that others will recognize that things are that way as well, and affirm that we really are good at basketball or attractive or intelligent. So wishful thinking results as a kind of it's strategic. I think it's a reputation enhancing strategy that you sort of optimistically buy into this fantasy, and that in turn inclines you to action, to put these things into action, to test against that. And sometimes it works out, sometimes it doesn't, though. And much of that depends on the standards of the community to which you're appealing, right? So if you're a scientist, then the standards of the community to which you're appealing is experimental success, right? So you want to say, look, gosh, I've got this idea, I've got this theory, it's testable, and I think it's right. And you devote all of your time and energy, perhaps even your career, to try to prove whether or not that's true or false. Now, if that works out, you're a genius, right? If that doesn't work out, you've wasted your entire life's work pursuing something, that you could have been using your mental resources towards something else. You might call it, in a sense, irrational or crazy, right? But it's not necessarily. It's not that that's a bad thing to choose, because there might be fruit that comes out of the failures that ends up being worthwhile, especially if you're engaged with the scientific community, right? Because your peers are there to guide your thoughts, to give you important feedback, and to help make sure that things progress, even in the light of failure, that there's still something worthwhile that comes out of that. If you're a conspiracy theorist, now there's no way to there's nothing that can come out of that, right? I want to be careful there, because just because something's a conspiracy theory doesn't mean that's necessarily false. It's unlikely to be true, but I'm impatient. I'm an impatient intellectual, and for me, it's a waste of time. But there's not really a good reason to buy into these things, but the reason that we might do that is because we want to appeal to a particular community, right? So there's this community that thinks that there's this government, the shadow government, that's running everything, and by buying into that and then looking for evidence and distorting the things that we find and promoting that, we in turn raise our reputation, our standing within that community. And, it's something that it works out for that individual, but, it might be maladaptive, because even though there's success within that niche community, it comes at the cost of success in the broader community at large, of which they're a part of, right? So, you're unlikely to have a successful academic career. You're unlikely to be taken seriously by intellectuals when you endeavor upon that way of life. Whether or not that's important to you, it's a different question.
Yeah, but perhaps, conspiracy theories, perhaps believing in them and promoting them could be a good strategy to certain types of people. Perhaps it is even it is even useful or good from an evolutionary perspective to certain people to adopt that kind of intellectual position because, for example, if they were to try to elevate their reputation in the mainstream population, let's say, it would be very difficult for them because they would be competing with much more people, and if they create their niche group with a few people where they are able to really elevate themselves to a good enough position, perhaps from an evolutionary perspective, to have access to more resources, including sexual resources as well. Perhaps the fact that they are defending and promoting and believing in something that is completely disconnected from reality, let's say, I mean, it could have some social value to them, perhaps.
Absolutely. And you know, I want to make clear it's not necessarily maladaptive, right? I mean, these things are a lot of fun. I derive great pleasure from seeing the wild conspiracy theories that people come up with. And I'm sure that, you know, for them, there's a satisfying element to that. People admire them, you know, even if you don't believe in it, some people will just admire the creativity, such as myself. I'm just like, you know, I fundamentally disagree with you, but that's, you know, good on you for putting that much effort into that. You know, it only becomes maladaptive, wishful thinking, when it starts to compromise your ability to flourish within one of those evolutionary domains, and arguably across all of the evolutionary domains, right? So when it jeopardizes your well-being, right, because you're paranoid that you know, government agents are after you, so you wire up your home with all sorts of booby traps, and you know, there's a risk that that could end up harming you in the long run, or somebody calls you know, some sort of government agency on you, and you know, that never ends well. That's not good. That's maladaptive, right? It jeopardizes your survival. It could jeopardize your, you know, sexual options, right? If you say something that's so outlandish that it only totally isolates you from everyone else, less likely in today's connected world where you seem to be able to find a niche for just about anything on the internet. But certainly in the past, where when you're part of a much smaller community, you would not be advertising these things if it runs counter to what the community tends to believe. And then obviously socially, right? That overlaps a little bit with the sexual opportunities, the mating opportunities, but you know, it has more to do with one's reputation within the community, and you know, you can start to feel as though you're ostracized, and I think we've evolved to be terrified of feeling ostracized, feeling like we're not contributing anything, right? That in itself motivates us to want to be a part of a community, to contribute to that community, to be productive.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we've been talking a lot about the modular or the modularist approach to the human mind, that is the mind being divided into several different cognitive modules, each of which evolved to deal with a very specific kind of evolutionarily relevant problem, let's put it that way. But I would like to ask you, what is your position about that? Because even among evolutionary psychologists and people that accept this approach, they don't all think about it in the same ways. So, for example, there are people that really have an approach of the massive modularity of the human mind, where they really believe that it is all modules, domain-specific modules, and nothing else. And then there are people that refer to, for example, learning processes, and say or defend the idea that perhaps we have some I don't know if we should call them modules or not, but perhaps cognitive systems of the mind that are domain general and open-ended, because it really seems from a certain perspective that people are able to learn virtually anything, even things like quantum physics and mathematics, which from an evolutionary perspective, I mean, they are so counterintuitive that it doesn't really seem to make sense for us to even be able to learn about those things. So what do you think about that?
So the modularity thesis is the newest part of my project, and as such, it's the least developed. It's one of the the legs of the tripod that I've constructed for myself that I plan to hopefully spend my career studying. So I don't have as much input on this as I would like. I can just kind of tell you where I tentatively stand on things, and that's that I take an extremely fine-grained approach to the mind, and I think that there are composite modules that are composed of submodules, if you will. But I think this goes down to some really simple workings that, I don't even think we've come close to scratching the surface of exactly how the mind works. So again, to invoke that analogy of what we understand about the visual system, I think what we're going to find when we start taking the modularity approach seriously and looking at it, how it constructs cognition, is that, you've got a submodule for, causal reasoning with objects. You've got a submodule for causal reasoning with creatures. You have a problem-solving module. You have a reputation module. I feel like there are so many very highly specific submodules that ultimately construct cognition in the way that we experience it. And I'm really eager to explore this idea in more detail. I just haven't had an opportunity to do that yet.
Okay, good. Okay, so just two more questions. The next one is because I know that you've been asked this when you were defending your dissertation. That is, the professors that were evaluating you, I think, asked you at a certain point if you thought that perhaps the evolutionary process, as it was put forth by Darwin and then expanded by others over the last 150 years or so, if it really only promoted selfishness in people and in other animals. And I think you had a really interesting answer to that, so if you could share it with us.
Yeah, so again, I don't think that we can talk about the evolutionary process promoting selfishness because, one, we're not really privy to the way in which these things affect us, right? We can only work with the proximal causes of our behavior, the things that we experience, both within ourselves that are obviously unreliable and how we perceive others. So I think we just kind of, we live and breathe these things. We're a part of this system, and that's the reality of it, right? The second fact that we need to remember and to emphasize is that we are social creatures, right? We have evolved in these small egalitarian groups. We have evolved to have a concern for one another, to have a concern for where we stand with respect to one another, to interact with one another, to promote the goodness of for one another, that, for those that are part of our community. It just seems kind of silly to me to reduce, this talk of having evolved to a matter of selfishness, right? I don't even think that that's something that I don't even know that that's necessarily worthwhile to consider. We're social creatures.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. So the last question is it's about something that I really been thinking a lot about recently, and I think that the first person I asked about this was perhaps Simon Blackburn or someone like that. And then I also had this conversation with Rebecca Goldstein. I'm not sure if it is in the interview or not because I've had a long conversation with her before we started recording. But anyway, do you think, because I mean, it is very important for people this question about the meaning of life. And I guess that from a Darwinian perspective, we could give it a new twist in the sense that since the things that we usually associate with life having meaning, like for example, our emotions, our moral sentiments, and other things like that, since we know nowadays that all of those things that we have and that we named, they are really real. They are as real as atoms and any other thing in the universe because they are features of the mind that evolved for us to adapt to our environments and particularly to our social environments. That I mean, even if people do not pay a lot of attention to it, if they are, for example, very cynic or nihilistic, that those things that are the ones that in which we base the meaning of our lives, if life really then has some sort of objective meaning, and I'm not framing it in the sense of life being good or bad, or what is good or what is bad, but just that the tools that we need to create meaning in our lives really exist in that sense.
Yeah. Can you kind of rephrase that question a little bit?
Yeah, okay. So what I was trying to say perhaps was that. So when people refer to the meaning of life, they usually talk about certain things like morality and emotions and feeling this or feeling that in their lives, like love, for example. That is a thing that people really bring a lot to the table when talking about life being meaningful or not. So I'm not saying that people should or always value those things, but just that because we know through Darwinism and evolutionary biology and psychology that those things really exist, then that would mean that the tools we use cognitively to give meaning to life, that at least that really exists. And so in that sense, life would be objectively meaningful, even if you give different values to those things, let's say. I don't know if it's more clear now, but...
Yeah, so I guess for clarification, is the question whether or not life is meaningful beyond the existential sense of, somehow it's subjectively meaningful for yourself? Is that sort of the question?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. In the sense of the things that we think about when we attribute meaning to life or not, that they really exist in the sense of love really existing and not only being something that we come up with in our heads, that it is also part of the evolved repertoire of our minds, and so they exist as any other thing in the universe.
Yeah, I think that that's correct. My thought about it is that I think part of the hang up that causes so much existential dread for so many of us is that when we think of the meaning of life, whether or not life is meaningful, worthwhile, etc., we tend to do this from a Cartesian perspective, right? We introspectively, evaluate or assess our mental states, our emotions. I'm just like, I'm just not happy with anything right now. Life is worthless, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Or we look at our quality of life and we think, I can't do anything. Nothing's working out. Life is no longer worth living, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Evolutionarily speaking, we've got a lot of feedback mechanisms that tell us when we're on the right track with things, right? So, when we do something worthwhile, whether or not it's something as simple as satisfying our hunger pangs or contributing to a community, we get some nice dopamine rewards and we feel good about everything, right? The other side of it too is that I think when we're, musing about the meaning of life, we have to look at it from the perspective not of the Cartesian solitary reasoner, but from the perspective of behavior and from the perspective of, how we promote the good of the community, if you will, right? The community of which we're a part. And this is something that I didn't get a chance to clarify earlier in the conversation, so I want to make clear about this. There's not one community of which we're a part of, right? We're not a part of the human community in this cosmopolitan sense. There's numerous small communities of which we're a part of. It's in an indefinite number of small communities, right? So, your political orientation constitutes a community of which you're a part of. Your religious beliefs constitute a community of which you're a part of. Your family constitutes another community of which you're a part of. And sometimes there are tensions that arise between the demands of one community and the demands of another that we need to resolve. And that tension can cause quite a bit of stress for ourselves and perhaps even, incline us towards a depressive state or a depressive mood because we can't figure out how to satisfy the demands from both. So, when it comes to the meaning of life, I don't look at it as personal meaning, subjective meaning, or existential meaning. I just kind of see how it is the individual plays a role in a broader, society, a broader community, and that meaning emerges out of their activity and their contributions to those communities. In other words, making them somehow better. And of course, we can, sort of have a conversation about what constitutes better, and we can give evolutionary responses to that. Maybe not, though. Cultures. I think we're still learning what constitutes a good culture. Here in the West, we have a tendency to think that democracy and Western values are the only good values that there are. Maybe they are, maybe they're not. We need to have a conversation about that. But when it's all said and done, what makes life meaningful is, having a place within a broader community and feeling valued and worthwhile. And, that's why I think that no matter how hard life gets for an individual, as long as they feel like they're respected and valued and that they're contributing, that life is meaningful for them. It's meaningful for the community. And I think a tremendous case in point here is someone like Stephen Hawking, right? There's not a person that arguably had it worse in terms of quality of life. And yet he was able to overcome that in almost Nietzschean-like fashion and make tremendous contributions to the scientific community. And we love him for that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. So, Derek, just before we finish this here, is there already any place on the internet where people can find your dissertation?
Yes, my dissertation has recently been uploaded to the electronic and dissertation and theses archive. We can have a link for that in the YouTube description. I encourage anyone to read it, offer feedback. I really enjoy these conversations, and I'm not wedded to any ideas. Let's talk about it, see where things go, and maybe things will change.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good. So I will be putting that in the description box of the video for people to go there and check it out. It's very interesting, and we haven't really covered all of it in this conversation. But anyway, Derek, it was really a pleasure again to have you on the show and to talk about these issues with you.
Oh, thank you so much, Ricardo. I couldn't appreciate the opportunity more, and it was delightful.
Hi everybody, thank you for coming to my channel and for watching this interview until the end. I've started this channel in February 2018, and so I've been putting out regular interviews with academics and intellectuals from a variety of fields, and I would really like to ask you just to consider visiting my Patreon page and making a pledge there. Any amount, even $1, would already be a great help. And so otherwise, if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like, and hit the subscription button. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my patrons: Karen Litzke, Anne Blanchett, Per Elga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Chantal Gelina, Jim Frank, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, and Brian Rivera. Thank you for all.